What would you do if one cold winter night, riding through a canyon storm that could strip the life out of any man, you stumbled upon a half-frozen Apache girl? Her lips turning blue, her body shaking with the last threads of life, and you gave her your only blanket thinking it was just an act of mercy, only to wake the next morning and discover that in her people's eyes you hadn't just saved her life. You had married her. Would you stay? Or would you run? The wind howled through the canyon, a frigid, merciless beast that tore at my clothes and screamed in my ears. All I could see through the swirling snow was a single lonely figure huddled against a boulder, shivering, dying. It was a sight that clawed at something deep inside me, something no amount of trail dust or gun smoke could ever harden. The storm had been building since dawn, a low gray threat that had finally erupted, turning this mountain pass into a frozen wasteland. My horse, a weary but sure-footed bay named Ranger, struggled through the deepening drifts. I'd been riding for 3 days straight, pushing toward the trading post before the weather could trap me. The cold bit through my worn leather gloves and my breath came out in sharp white clouds. Each one felt like a small final surrender to the elements. Then I saw her, a shape barely moving. At first I thought it might be some stray, half-frozen animal seeking shelter. But as I rode closer, the shape became unmistakably human. A young Apache woman, no older than 19, was curled up in a thin deerskin dress that offered less protection than a spider web. Her lips were a stark, terrifying blue, and her entire body shook with a violence that made me want to get off my horse and wrap her in my own arms. I dismounted without a moment's hesitation. I'd seen enough death on the frontier to recognize its close kin. The woman's eyes fluttered open as I approached. Dark, intelligent eyes that held no fear, only a bone-deep resignation. She was beautiful, not in the way a painting is beautiful, but with a wild, untamed grace that made my chest tighten. But right now she was dying. The voices of the frontier echoed in my head. Tales I'd heard in saloons, stories of Apache raiders, of violence, of the unspoken rules that said helping the wrong person could get you killed. My gut churned with the ingrained prejudice I'd absorbed over the years. This was an Apache, one of the savages who had killed my uncle and burned my family's homestead. But looking down at her, at the simple, raw human need in her face, all those warnings felt distant, meaningless, like the fading memory of a bad dream. The only reality was the cold in this girl's failing body. My own life seemed a small price to pay to stop a young life from being snuffed out in the snow. I unwrapped the thick wool blanket from my bedroll. It was my most prized possession, the only thing keeping me from freezing on these cold nights. My grandmother had made it for me years ago, before the fever took her. The blue and gray pattern was faded now, but it still held heat like nothing else I owned. Every stitch, every thread was a memory of her calloused, loving hands. To give it up was a piece of me, a piece of my family, a piece of my past. Without a word, I wrapped the blanket around the shivering woman's shoulders. She looked up at me with a profound surprise, as if kindness from a white man was the last thing she ever expected. Her fingers, stiff with cold, gripped the edges of the blanket gratefully. "You'll be all right," I said softly, the words feeling foreign in the biting wind. I wasn't sure if she understood English, but I felt a desperate need to say something, anything. Her breathing began to steady, a small, hopeful sign as warmth returned to her body. A faint, natural color slowly came back to her cheeks. She studied my face with those penetrating dark eyes, and for a moment, something passed between us that neither of us could have possibly understood. An unspoken acknowledgement, a connection forged in the silence of the storm. I helped her to her feet and guided her to a more sheltered spot behind the rocks. I built a small fire, the flames a welcome dance against the gray canvas of the sky, and shared what little food I had. The woman who pointed to herself and said, Lena ate slowly, never taking her eyes off me. It was as if she were memorizing every detail of my face, every line etched by the sun and sorrow. As the storm raged around us, we sat in a comfortable silence. My fear and prejudice had vanished, replaced by a quiet wonder. I found myself stealing glances at her, wondering about her story. How had she ended up alone in a blizzard? Where was her family? But those questions would have to wait. They were questions for a different kind of day. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world bathed in pristine, silent white. Lena stood and carefully folded the blanket. She held it out to me, but I shook my head. The cold had passed, and I had my coat. She needed it more than I did, a thought that seemed to surprise even me. Her eyes widened at my refusal to take it back. She spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing between the blanket and herself, then pointing at me. Her tone was urgent, almost worried. I couldn't understand a word. I just smiled a simple, easy gesture and mounted my horse. Keep warm, I called back as I rode away thinking I'd done a good deed and would never see her again. But as Lena watched me disappear into the morning mist, she clutched the blanket tighter. In her culture, what had just happened meant something very different than what I believed. And by sunset, her people would come looking for answers that would change both our lives forever. I reached the trading post by mid-afternoon, my mind still replaying the encounter with the Apache woman. Something about those eyes haunted me. The way she'd looked at me when I refused to take the blanket back, almost like she was trying to warn me about something I couldn't possibly have known. The trading post sat in a valley surrounded by pine smoke rising from its stone chimney, a beacon of civilization in a harsh world. Inside, the warmth hit me like a physical wall, a deep bone-settling heat that made me finally feel human again. 3 other men huddled around a table playing cards and drinking whiskey. The trader, a grizzled man named Jedediah, looked up from cleaning his rifle. "Thomas Kincaid," Jedediah said, his voice a low rumble. "Didn't expect to see you until spring. That storm nearly killed my horses. Had to push through," I replied, unbuttoning my coat. "Got business in Santa Fe that won't wait." Jedediah poured me a cup of coffee. The liquid was steaming black and bitter, a familiar comfort. I wrapped my cold hands around the tin cup, the warmth making me think of Lena again, wondering if she'd made it to safety. "See any trouble on the trail?" one of the card players asked. It was a thin man named Silas with nervous eyes and a long scar across his jaw. "Apache have been moving through these parts. Folks are getting spooked." I hesitated, the coffee suddenly tasting sour in my mouth. My mind flashed back to Lena's eyes, to the way she had clutched my blanket. I thought about mentioning her, but a cold knot of dread formed in my gut. These men wouldn't understand. They'd see only the danger, not the frightened young woman who'd nearly frozen to death. They'd see an enemy, a threat, a problem to be solved with lead and fire. "Nothing I couldn't handle," I said finally. The words felt like a betrayal. The scarred man leaned back in his chair, a smirk on his face. "Smart to keep moving. Last week they hit a wagon train 20 miles south, took everything, left the bodies for the buzzards." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "Animals, the lot of them." My jaw tightened. The word animals echoed in my head, a vile, ugly accusation. I remembered Lena's grateful smile, the silent intelligence in her eyes. Whatever those raiders had done, she wasn't a part of it. She was just a woman who'd needed help, a soul shivering in the snow. Jedediah refilled my cup. "You can bunk here tonight. Got a room in the back, but I'd move on at first light if I were you. Been hearing drums in the hills. When they start drumming, trouble follows." As if summoned by his words, a low, rhythmic beating drifted through the valley, a sound as old as the earth itself. It was low and steady, like a heartbeat that wasn't my own. The card game stopped. All eyes turned toward the windows, though there was nothing to see but a darkening sky. "There it is again," Silas whispered. "Been going on for hours." I set down my cup, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The drumming seemed to be coming from multiple directions surrounding the valley. It wasn't random. There was a pattern to it, like a conversation being held in a language I couldn't understand, a conversation with my name in it. "Maybe they're just passing through," Jedediah said, but his hand moved instinctively to his rifle. Then abruptly the drumming stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound itself, a quiet filled with menace and expectation. My thoughts turned back to the blanket, to the urgent way Lena had spoken to me. Had she been trying to tell me something important? A warning that her people were coming. That the blanket meant something I couldn't comprehend. "I'll take that room," I said, finishing my coffee in one gulp. But as I settled into the narrow bunk that night, sleep wouldn't come. The drums had started again, closer this time, a deeper, more resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in my bones. And somewhere in that rhythm, in the spaces between the beats, I could swear I heard my name being called. Outside, my window shadows moved between the trees. Not the random movement of animals, but the purposeful advance of people who knew exactly where they were going. People who were looking for someone, and in my gut I knew they were looking for me. Dawn came too early and too quiet. The drumming had stopped some time before sunrise, leaving behind an unnatural silence that made my skin crawl. Even the birds seemed afraid to sing. I dressed quickly, my hands a little shaky, and stepped outside to check on my horse. The animal was restless, ears twitching at sounds only it could hear. Jedediah emerged from the main building, rifle in hand, and worry etched deep in his weathered face. "They're out there," he said quietly. "Been watching us all night. Haven't seen them, but I can feel eyes on me." I scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being observed was unmistakable, like standing in front of a loaded gun. I saddled Ranger, every movement deliberate and calm. Panic would only make things worse. "I'm riding out," I announced. "No point staying here if they want something." "You're crazy," Silas said from the doorway, his voice a hoarse whisper. "They'll pick you off before you reach the ridge." But I was already mounting up. Whatever was happening, hiding wouldn't solve it. I'd rather face it in the open than wait to be cornered like a rat. I rode slowly up the main trail, my hands visible and away from my weapons, a show of surrender before a fight had even begun. The morning mist clung to the valley floor, making everything look ghostly and uncertain. Ranger's hooves echoed off the canyon walls, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. Then they appeared. 7 Apache warriors materialized from the trees like shadows given form. They didn't rush forward or raise weapons. They simply stepped into view and waited, blocking the trail ahead. Their horses were painted for war, but the men themselves seemed calm, almost ceremonial. My hand instinctively moved toward my gun, then stopped. These weren't raiders. Their posture was formal, not threatening. One of them, an older man with intricate beadwork on his shirt, raised his hand in a gesture that clearly meant stop. I reined in my horse, my heart hammering against my ribs. The older Apache spoke in his native tongue, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Behind him, the other warriors remained motionless, their dark eyes studying me, with an intensity that made me feel like a specimen under glass. Then from behind the group, another figure emerged. Lena. She wore the same deerskin dress, but my blue and gray blanket was now draped over her shoulders like a ceremonial cloak. Her eyes met mine, and I saw something there that made my blood run cold. Not fear or gratitude, but a profound responsibility. Heavy, unavoidable responsibility. The older Apache spoke again, and this time Lena translated her English, carefully pronounced, but tinged with an accent that made each word sound musical. "My grandfather says you have claimed me as your wife," she said simply. Ranger shifted beneath me as if responding to my shock. "What, I never the blanket?" The words tumbled out, a useless defense. Lena continued, her voice growing stronger. "In our ways, when a man gives his blanket to protect a woman, he declares his intention to provide for her, always to be her husband." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the blanket, my grandmother's blanket, now transformed into something I'd never intended it to be. A marriage contract written in wool and good intentions. "That's not what I meant," I said, my voice desperate. "I was just trying to help." Lena's grandfather, Chief Teshin, spoke again, his tone brooking no argument. Lena translated, though her voice had become smaller, more vulnerable. "He says intentions matter less than actions. You saved my life and claimed me as yours. Now you must honor that choice." The canyon walls seemed to close in around me as the full weight of my situation became clear. A simple act of kindness had bound me to a woman I barely knew in a culture I didn't understand, with consequences I couldn't even imagine. My mouth went dry as dust. 7 pairs of eyes watched me, waiting for an answer that could determine whether I lived to see another sunset. The morning air suddenly felt thin, making each breath a conscious effort. "I don't understand your ways," I said carefully, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Where I come from, giving someone a blanket just means you don't want them to freeze to death." Chief Teshin, who Lena called Teshin, listened to the translation and responded with what sounded like a question. His weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes held the sharpness of a man who'd survived by reading people's hearts. "He asks if you would have given the blanket to an Apache man," Lena translated, her voice barely above a whisper. The question cut straight to the truth. I thought about it honestly. Would I have stopped for an Apache warrior? Would I have risked my own warmth for someone who might have been my enemy? The answer sat heavy in my chest. "Probably not," I admitted, a confession that felt raw and shameful. Teshin nodded, as if this confirmed something he already knew. He spoke again, his words flowing like water over stones, ancient and certain. He says, "You chose to see me as a woman, first Apache second. This shows honor, but honor carries responsibility." One of the younger warriors, his hand resting on his weapon, shifted restlessly on his horse. I caught the movement and felt sweat trickle down my spine despite the morning chill. These men weren't just here to talk. They were here to enforce their customs, whatever the cost. "What happens if I refuse?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Lena hesitated before translating. The conversation that followed was rapid and intense, with several warriors joining in. I watched their faces, trying to read the emotions behind words I couldn't understand. When they finished, Lena's face had gone pale. "If you refuse, you dishonor not just me but my family," she said, her voice trembling. "My grandfather would be obligated to restore our honor through blood." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. I looked at each warrior in turn, seeing the grim resolution in their faces. They weren't bluffing. In their world, this wasn't negotiable. But then I looked at Lena. Really looked at her. She stood straight and proud, but I could see the fear she was trying to hide. Fear of what would happen to me. Fear of what would happen to her family if violence erupted. Fear of being caught between two worlds that didn't understand each other. There has to be another way, I said, finally, my mind racing. Some test or trial I can undergo instead. Teshin's eyebrows raised slightly, the first crack in his stoic expression. He spoke to Lena, who looked surprised by my response. He says you speak like a warrior, not a coward. This is unexpected, she paused. He will consider your words. But first you must come to our village to understand what you are truly choosing. The young warrior who'd been fingering his weapon, the one I now recognized as Kuruk, spoke harshly, clearly disagreeing with this decision. Teshin silenced him with a sharp look and what sounded like a rebuke. My cousin believes you should be forced to choose now, Lena explained. He thinks you will try to escape if given time. I met Kuruk's hostile glare. I could see the barely contained violence there, the desire to solve this problem with blood instead of words. One wrong move, one sign of disrespect, and this canyon would become a battlefield. I give you my word, I said, addressing Teshin directly. I won't run. As Lena translated, I realized I just committed myself to something far more dangerous than a simple marriage proposal. I'd agreed to enter an Apache village surrounded by people who had every reason to hate me, to face customs and trials I couldn't even imagine. But as they began to ride deeper into the mountains, one thought echoed in my mind. I was no longer just trying to save my own life. Somehow, without meaning to, I'd become responsible for saving Lena's as well. The Apache village materialized from the landscape like a mirage, becoming real. Hidden in a valley between towering red cliffs, it was larger than I had expected. Dozens of traditional dwellings were scattered along a clear stream, with smoke rising from cooking fires and the sound of children's laughter echoing off the canyon walls. But as our group approached, the laughter stopped. Faces appeared in doorways and from behind trees. Men, women, children, all watching the white man who rode among their warriors. Some expressions showed curiosity. Others barely concealed hostility. I felt like a wolf walking into a sheep pen, except I wasn't sure who the predator was here. Teshin led us to the center of the village, where a large fire pit was surrounded by logs arranged in a circle. An elderly woman emerged from the largest dwelling, her silver hair braided with turquoise beads. Her eyes, sharp as obsidian, fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to look away. My grandmother Lena said quietly, "Imala, she is not pleased." Imala spoke rapidly to Teshin, her voice rising with what was clearly anger. She gestured toward me several times, her words cutting through the air like knife blades. Other villagers began to gather, forming a loose circle around the fire pit. "What's she saying?" I asked, my voice low and tight. Lena's face flushed with embarrassment. "She says you smell like whiskey and violence. That bringing you here puts the whole village at risk." She paused, her eyes downcast. "She also says I have brought shame on our family by accepting gifts from a stranger." The crowd grew larger and more agitated. I could pick out individual voices now, some arguing, others demanding. A young man about my own age pushed forward, speaking directly to Lena with obvious passion. She shook her head repeatedly, but he persisted. "Who's that?" I asked, though the jealousy in the man's eyes made the answer obvious. Kuruk. Lena's voice was barely audible. "He has asked for my hand many times. He says this is a trick to avoid marrying me." Kuruk stepped closer to me, his hand resting on a knife at his belt. He spoke in English, the words heavily accented but clear enough. "You take what is not yours. White man, leave now, or I will cut out your lying tongue." The threat sent a ripple of tension through the crowd. I felt the weight of every eye upon me. One wrong word, one aggressive move, and this would explode into violence that would destroy any chance of peaceful resolution. "I didn't take anything," I said calmly. "I gave something. There's a difference." Kuruk's face darkened. "You gave nothing. You trick sacred customs for your pleasure, then run back to your people." Before I could respond, Imala stepped between us. She spoke sharply to Kuruk, who reluctantly backed away, though his eyes never left my face. Then she turned her attention to her granddaughter, her voice heavy with disappointment. Lena's shoulders sagged as she listened. When Imala finished speaking, tears glistened in the young woman's eyes. "She says I must choose," Lena whispered. "Either prove that your intentions are honorable by completing the marriage trials, or admit that I was foolish, and accept Kuruk's proposal instead." The marriage trials, I felt my stomach drop. "What kind of trials?" "3 tests, Lena explained, her voice strengthening as she spoke. "Strength, wisdom, and sacrifice. If you fail any of them, she didn't need to finish. The alternative was written in the hostile faces surrounding me. Teshin spoke again and the crowd fell silent. His voice carried the authority of law itself. He says the trials begin at sunset, Lena translated. And if you try to leave before they're completed, Kuruk has permission to hunt you down. I looked around the circle of faces, some hopeful, others eager for my failure. But it was Lena's expression that decided me. Behind the fear and uncertainty, I saw something that reminded me why I'd given her the blanket in the first place. She was worth protecting, worth fighting for, even if I didn't fully understand why. Then I guess we'd better get started, I said, a weary resolve settling over me. As the sun began to sink behind the canyon walls, the entire village gathered around the central fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the red stone cliffs, turning the peaceful valley into something primal and ancient. I stood at the edge of the circle, watching the Apache prepare for what felt more like a funeral than a wedding ceremony. Teshin approached carrying 3 objects. A thick rope, a piece of carved wood covered in symbols, and a small leather pouch that clinked softly when he moved. He set them down near the fire and began to speak, his voice carrying over the crackling flames. The first trial tests your strength, Lena translated, standing beside me. You must climb the sacred cliff face using only the rope, reach the eagle's nest, and bring back a feather. I looked up at the towering wall of stone that rose behind the village. Even in the fading light, I could see it was nearly vertical, with few handholds and loose rock that would crumble under weight. The eagle's nest was a dark smudge about 60 feet up, impossibly high and dangerous. Men have died attempting this, Lena added quietly. Even our own warriors sometimes fail. Kuruk stepped forward, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. He gestured toward the cliff with obvious contempt, clearly suggesting that the white man would never succeed where Apache warriors had failed. He says you will fall like a stone, Lena translated. That your soft hands have never held anything harder than a whiskey bottle. The insult stung because it wasn't entirely wrong. I was strong enough, but rope climbing wasn't exactly a common skill for cowboys. Still, I'd been in tighter spots. At least I hoped I had. I stripped off my coat and hat, feeling the evening chill bite at my skin. The rope was rough hemp, worn smooth in places by previous climbers. As I tested its strength, I could feel the weight of every eye in the village watching me. The first 20 feet went easier than I expected. My arms and shoulders burned, but years of ranch work had given me strength I didn't know I possessed. The rope bit into my palms, drawing blood, but I kept climbing, one hand over the other, my boots scrambling for purchase on the cliff face. Halfway up, my luck ran out. A section of rock crumbled away beneath my feet, leaving me swinging free on the rope. The crowd below gasped, and someone, maybe Lena, cried out. My shoulders screamed in protest as they took my full weight. For a moment I hung there, spinning slowly, looking down at the faces below. Kuruk was smiling, already anticipating my failure. But it was Lena's expression that drove me upward. Not fear, but fierce determination, as if she was climbing the cliff herself through sheer force of will. I found new footholds and continued my ascent. The eagle's nest loomed above me, a tangle of sticks and bones, built on a narrow ledge. As I reached for it, a massive golden eagle burst from the shadows, talons extended and wings beating furiously around my head. I ducked, nearly losing my grip as the bird screamed its outrage. Its talons raked across my shoulder, tearing my shirt and drawing blood. But there, caught in the thorny branches of the nest, was a single perfect feather. I grabbed it and began my descent, muscles trembling with exhaustion. Every foot downward was agony, but I refused to let go. When my boots finally touched the ground, my legs buckled and I collapsed to my knees. The village erupted in surprised murmurs. Even Kuruk looked stunned that the white man had succeeded. I held up the eagle feather, its golden brown surface gleaming in the firelight. Teshin took the feather and examined it carefully before nodding his approval. He spoke briefly, and Lena translated with obvious relief in her voice. He says the eagle fought you, but you persevered. The first trial is complete. But before I could catch my breath, Teshin picked up the carved wooden piece. It was covered in intricate symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight. The second trial tests your wisdom, Lena, said her voice growing tense again. You must solve the riddle of the ancestor stone before the fire burns down to embers. I looked at the symbols, then at the fire. It was large now, but wood burned fast in the dry mountain air. I had maybe an hour, probably less. What happens if I can't solve it? I asked. Lena hesitated. Then you have failed 2 trials, and failure means... She didn't finish. But the answer was written in Kuruk's eager expression. Failure meant death, and success was looking more impossible by the minute. As I stared at the ancestor stone, trying to make sense of symbols that might as well have been written by aliens, one thought echoed in my mind. How do you solve a riddle when you don't even understand the language it's written in? I turned the carved stone over in my bleeding hands, studying the symbols that seemed to mock me with their ancient mystery. The fire crackled lower, each spark that died taking me closer to failure. Around the circle, villagers whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads as if my defeat was already certain. The symbols were unlike anything I'd seen before. Some looked like animals, a barren eagle, what might have been a snake. Others resembled natural features. Mountains, rivers, the sun and moon. But how they connected, what story they told, remained as impenetrable as the cliff I'd just climbed. Can you give me a hint? I asked Lena desperately. She shook her head, genuine sadness in her eyes. The wisdom trial must be completed alone. To help you would dishonor both of us. Kuruk spoke up from across the fire, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Even without translation, I could tell he was declaring victory prematurely. Several villagers nodded in agreement. The fire burned lower. Time was running out. I forced myself to think differently. Maybe the solution wasn't in understanding Apache symbols, but in understanding universal truths. Every culture had stories, patterns that repeated across time and place. I studied the stone again, looking for familiar elements. There in the center, a spiral that could represent the cycle of seasons. Around it, the animals I'd identified earlier, but now I noticed they were arranged in a specific order. A bear in the position where the sun would be in summer. An eagle where it would be in spring. A snake where autumn would fall. Seasons, I murmured. It's about the seasons, but that couldn't be the whole answer. There were other symbols, other elements that didn't fit the seasonal pattern. A figure that looked like a person standing at the center of the spiral lines, radiating outward from the human figure to each animal. Then it hit me. Not just seasons, but the relationship between humans and nature through the seasons. The bear for summer when they hunted for food to store. The eagle for spring when they needed its strength to build and grow. The snake for autumn when they prepared for the coming winter, shedding old ways like a snake sheds its skin. And winter there in the fourth position was a symbol I'd missed before. Not an animal, but what looked like a blanket or maybe a shelter. Something that provided protection and warmth. When the world turned cold, my heart began to race. This wasn't just a riddle about seasons. It was about my story, my journey to this place. The riddle isn't asking what the symbols mean, I said aloud, my voice carrying across the suddenly quiet circle. It's asking why I'm here. I stood up, holding the stone toward Teshin. Each symbol represents a choice. The bear, the choice to take what you need by force. The eagle, the choice to soar above others' suffering. The snake, the choice to shed your responsibilities when times get hard. I paused, looking directly at Lena. And the blanket, the choice to give warmth even when it costs you. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, but Teshin held up his hand to stop the trial. He spoke quickly to Lena, who looked stunned by my answer. He says, "You understand that wisdom isn't about knowing our symbols, but about knowing yourself," she translated. The ancestor stone shows the 4 paths a man can take when faced with another's suffering. You chose the path of the blanket. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Even Kuruk looked surprised. But Teshin wasn't finished speaking. "The second trial is complete," Lena continued. "But my grandfather says, the third trial is the most dangerous. It tests not your body or mind, but your heart." Teshin picked up the leather pouch, and the clinking sound seemed ominous in the near darkness. When he opened it, I saw it contained small bones, finger bones carved with more symbols. "The trial of sacrifice," Lena whispered. "You must choose what you're willing to lose to gain what you claim to want." As the bones scattered on the ground in patterns only Teshin could read, I realized that surviving the first 2 trials might have been the easy part, because what was coming next would ask me to examine the one thing I'd been avoiding. Since this all began what I truly wanted, and what I was willing to pay to get it, the bone casting seemed to take forever. Teshin studied the pattern with the intensity of a man reading life and death in scattered fragments. The village held its collective breath as he finally spoke, his words heavy with the weight of ancient law. "The bones have chosen the sacrifice." Lena translated, her voice barely audible. "You must give up the thing you value most in this world. Only then can you claim what you seek." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What if I don't know what I value most?" I asked, a tremor in my voice. Teshin smiled grimly and gestured toward my horse, still saddled and waiting at the edge of the village. Then he pointed to the gun belt around my waist. Finally, his finger settled on the faded photograph. Tucked into my shirt pocket, a picture of my parents, the only thing I had left of my family. He says, "A man always knows," Lena whispered. "The bones will reveal what you try to hide from yourself." Karuk stepped forward, speaking rapidly and gesturing toward the scattered bones. His tone was challenging, almost mocking. Several other villagers nodded in agreement with whatever he was saying. "My cousin says this is foolishness," Lena explained. "That no white man would sacrifice anything real for an Apache woman. He believes you will choose to leave rather than give up what matters to you." I looked at each item Teshin had indicated. My horse ranger represented freedom, the ability to go anywhere, be anyone. My gun meant protection, the power to defend myself in a hostile world. And the photograph. That was my past, my identity, the last connection to who I'd been before this moment. But as I stood there, surrounded by faces lit by dying embers, I realized something that surprised me. None of those things felt as important as they had yesterday. The horse was just an animal. The gun was just a tool. Even the photograph, precious as it was, represented people who were already gone. What mattered was the living. What mattered was the woman standing beside me, caught between worlds because of my actions. "I know what I have to sacrifice," I said quietly, the words firm and clear. I reached into my shirt and pulled out the photograph. My parents stared back at me from the faded paper. My father stern and proud, my mother gentle and kind. For years this image had been my anchor, the reminder of where I came from and who I was supposed to be. But holding on to the past meant I couldn't embrace the future. I walked to the fire pit and knelt beside the glowing embers. "I sacrifice my old life," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the village. The man I was, the plans I had, the world I knew. I give it all up to become the man Lena deserves. I placed the photograph on the coals. The paper caught fire, immediately curling and blackening, as my parents' faces disappeared into smoke. The loss hit me like a physical blow, a tearing away of my very soul, but I didn't flinch or look away. The village erupted in surprised murmurs. Even Karuk seemed stunned by the gesture, but it was Lena's expression that mattered most. Wonder and something deeper, something that looked like the beginning of love. Teshin spoke again, his voice filled with a respect that hadn't been there before. "You have proven yourself worthy," Lena translated, tears streaming down her face. "Not because you completed the trials, but because you understood what they truly meant. Strength without wisdom is useless. Wisdom without sacrifice is meaningless." Imala, the grandmother who had been so hostile earlier, approached me with something in her hands. It was a new shirt made of soft deerskin and decorated with intricate beadwork. She spoke softly as she offered it to me. She says, "Welcome to the family," Lena whispered. As I put on the shirt, I felt something shift inside me. The cowboy who had ridden into this valley no longer existed. In his place stood a man who had chosen love over freedom, connection over independence, and a future over the past. Karuk approached, his earlier hostility replaced by a grudging respect. He spoke briefly to me in English. "You fight like Apache," he said simply. "She chose well." As the village began to celebrate around us, I took Lena's hand. The blanket, my grandmother's blanket, was still draped over her shoulders. But now it meant something different than it had that snowy morning. Now it was exactly what the Apache had always seen it, as a promise, a commitment, a choice to put someone else's warmth before my own. "Do you regret it?" Lena asked quietly. "Giving up your old life?" I looked into her dark eyes, seeing my future reflected there. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the life I'd chosen. And sometimes I realized the best decisions were the ones you made with your heart instead of your head. "The only thing I regret," I said, pulling her closer, "is that it took me so long to understand what that blanket really meant." As the celebration continued around us, I knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, learning Apache customs, finding my place in this tight-knit community, building a marriage based on respect rather than just circumstance. But tonight, with Lena's hand in mine and my grandmother's blanket wrapped around both our shoulders, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt like I was home. In the end, this Wild West tale reminds us of something deeply human. Kindness is never just a small gesture. The cowboy thought he was giving away only a blanket, but in truth, he offered something far greater: compassion, trust, and the courage to see another soul beyond prejudice. For older generations who have carried both love and loss across many winters, the story speaks to how the simplest acts can bind us together in ways we do not expect. We all hold blankets of our own, a word of encouragement, a moment of patience, a willingness to listen. These gifts may seem ordinary to us, but to someone in need, they can mean warmth, dignity, and even life itself. The trials the cowboy faced of strength, wisdom, and sacrifice are the same tests we all meet in quieter forms. To endure hardship, to learn from the past, and to let go of what no longer serves us, these are the real measures of character. And like the cowboy, we discover that true belonging does not come from holding on to what was, but from giving ourselves to what is yet to come. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.